My dearest mother, here at Versailles, it is heavenly to walk up and down the large galleries in the château and in the walks of the parks, thinking of lost, powerful days of Louis XIV with his glorious court, and Marie Antoinette wandering with her children. They have all been swept away, and the banner of the revolution triumphs over the palace. With these words, the 23-year-old Swedish merchant apprentice, Claes Lagergren, described his very first encounter with the Château de Versailles. The year was 1876, and the life of the young Swede was soon to take a drastic turn. Born in the Swedish region of Närke in 1853 in a prosperous farmer's home, Lagergren spent his early school days dreaming of a future on the stage as an actor. His parents strongly disapproved and put him through an education aiming at a career in trade. In the 1870s, he was sent to France in order to gain professional expertise. The social life of Paris suited Lagergren perfectly. Handsome, clever, and equipped with an extraordinary social ability, he gained the confidence and subsequent inheritance from a French lady that had acted as his benefactor. The inherited fortune permitted the young man to abandon his professional career and to take on the globe-trotting lifestyle of a wealthy man. Travels in Northern Africa were soon replaced by steady and long visits to Rome. The turbulent decade of the 1870s, in the aftermaths of the unification of Italy, which Lagergren was to experience and witness, had brought to the city a rupture which didn't just include a radical urban replanning and the making of an efficient public administration worthy of a modern nation, but also an entire revision of the idea of the Roman ruling class. The secular powers of the popes were definitely banned when the papal states were added to the Kingdom of Italy in 1870. This led to a strong reaction within the Roman nobility, which subsequently was to become divided into two separate fractions: the white nobility, faithful to the king and to the new order, and the black nobility, which forcefully and visually gave their support to the papacy. Lagergren became instantly attracted to the latter, and apparent last defenders of the Ancien Régime. He quickly made his way into these black families, and after his conversion to the Roman Catholic faith in 1880, new possibilities of a career in the Vatican opened up. Indeed, Pope Leo XIII appointed him Chamberlain of the Papal Court in 1884. Lagergren's duties in the Vatican did not prevent him from traveling with a faithful companion and fellow convert, the wealthy Bostonian John Howe. Howe and Lagergren did not only share a religious conviction, but also a vivid passion for French history, with a particular regard for the early modern centuries. Lagergren's slow and firm adaptation of his own public persona was connected to a deep conservatism linked to a lifelong fascination for the victims of what he saw as a disruptive and traumatic political catastrophe, namely the French Revolution. This conservative pathos involved a dreaming notion of the Ancien Régime that brought him to condemn bourgeois values and manners to which he belonged by birth. His strong desire to defend the old aristocratic values of a pre-industrial world and his despising of the class mobility of the capitalist era is actually well summarized through his feelings when visiting the cell of Robespierre in the Parisian Conciergerie prison, close to that, ironically, of Marie Antoinette. And I quote, "What a bitter irony, what a divine justice, what a sweet revenge," end of quote. Claes Lagergren was a natural storyteller. His dense memoirs, Memories of My Life, published in 12 volumes in the years 1922 to 1931, constitute an extraordinary source to the understanding of the making of his public persona. The style of these memoirs is varied, offering contemporary anecdotes from the fashionable sets in late 19th century Europe, with long passages of history, often inspired from early modern memoir writers or simply the latest edition of the Baedeker guidebooks. His lifelong traveling is given a prominent position, and consequently, his visits to France and Versailles are frequently mentioned. Since the memoirs were based on his personal diaries and not always edited with precision, they offer an interesting mixture of general and impersonal remarks, as well as highly personal opinions. Turning back to his letter to his mother in 1876, we see that Lagergren mentioned this ever first visit to Versailles with regards to the large galleries with paintings. He is particularly intrigued by the portraits on display and boasts triumphantly that he recognized almost every sitter. Omitted from the letter but emphasized in the published memoir is his visit to Petit Trianon. And as he wandered around Le Hameau de la Reine, he, and I quote, lived entirely in the past, end of quote. His visits to the château gives a hint of the established museum tour at that time. Lagergren mentions that it was a great pity and harm to have to start with the historical paintings of Louis Philippe and to lose so much time on that, end of quote. Once arrived into what he considered the heart of the palace, that is, the Galerie des Glaces and the bedchamber of Louis XIV, he expressed a tiredness, but gained new courage in order to dutifully visit every room, including all battle paintings by Horace Vernet and the portrait series in the Attique du Nord and Attique du Midi. Released from this duty, he was happy to experience Les Grandes Halles from the terrace and in the park, thinking of little else than Louis XIV. These first written impressions of Versailles, even if apparently superficial and rather commonplace, already embody the most important factors that actually came to characterize Lagergren's view of an understanding of the palace. In 1886, he visited the chateau once more, and this time together with John Howe, and I quote, "We couldn't have chosen a better place to stay for than a few weeks at Versailles, where I could wander around the Galerie des Glaces and the other rooms for days and days and days, where the old times unfolded like rapturing paintings," end of quote. By this time, Lagergren had brought a guidebook, namely Louis-Étienne Ducieux's Château de Versailles, Histoire et Description, published the first time in 1871. From the memoirs, we learn that Lagergren thought this to be a rather excellent book, since it offered extensive plans from the times of Louis XV and XIV on transparent paper that could be juxtaposed to the actual plans printed in the book. This gave the readers the opportunity to locate the exact position of, for instance, the rooms of Madame de Maintenon in relation to those of Louis XIV. Indeed, this insight gave Lagergren the opportunity in the memoir to dedicate several pages of this particular volume of the memoir to anecdotes involving the Sun King and his last mistress, all stories and anecdotes told by essentially Saint-Simon and Madame de Sévigné. So he repeated all of these anecdotes that were reliable and present in these historical sources, and he repeated them in the published memoir, often in connection with this type of portraits that he could or had actually seen in Versailles. And I just wanted to illustrate his great interest in Madame de Maintenon by Pierre Mignard's portrait of the last mistress of Louis XIV. Lagergren's impressions of Versailles were from start defined by, first and foremost, a desired familiarity. Versailles was the symbol of the source of his own political convictions, and this sought-after familiarity apparently brought him to describe the site with studied nonchalance and a sense of belonging. Since boyhood, his interest in French history had matured a never-ending passion for biographies and human destiny. The latter nurtured his vivid interest in portraiture, so apparent in his own vast collection of photographic portraits of his contemporaries. It is evident that when visiting Versailles, his focus was entirely on the displayed portraits of the Bourbon dynasty and its courtiers. It is equally evident that his daydreaming written notions of Marie Antoinette playing and walking with her children, a trope that he constantly returns to, were informed by portraits of the Queen that he had seen, not the least Adolf Ludwig Wertmüller's 1787 effigy of the Queen and her children, walking in the grounds of the Petit Trianon, which was fully visible at the Nationalmuseum in Stockholm by that time. Claes Lagergren did not ever develop a full taste and knowledge regarding art and architecture. His writings of Versailles exclude deeper information regarding the palace's architectural history or the forming of the collections. Indeed, he would have found such notions too bourgeois and distanced from what he experienced as the true way of understanding the site. He experienced Versailles as a proper stage of the past, a scenographic framework for people, actions, and destinies, more than an extraordinary example of, for instance, French architecture. And I quote, "All these salons of Versailles came to life with all these people that I knew so well," end of quote. At the heart of these experiences is a strong link to his own political and legitimist views, and the double role that Versailles played in his own understanding of the world as the absolute symbol of the righteous order of power, and therefore the happiest of places, and at the same time a symbol of the destruction of that very same order. Knowing the historical ghosts of the palace meant entering into an intimate connection of belonging that elevated his own status in the contemporary world. In 1891, Lagergren married in Rome the wealthy American Caroline Russell. This transatlantic marriage, quite uncommon in the Swedish context at the time, but more so in the Italian one, with which Lagergren was so closely connected, turned out very well. 2 years before the marriage, the Pope had appointed Lagergren with the title of Marquis, the only ever in Sweden, and made sure that the title would be inherited according to the law of primogeniture. The new honor and the marriage to a lady of large fortune made it appropriate and possible to acquire a proper home in Sweden, namely Tyresö estate, and castle outside Stockholm. The castle, which had an 18th century appearance when Lagergren bought it, was soon restored into a full 17th century glory, and it became the Swedish home of the Lagergren family when not in Rome. 3 sons were born into the marriage: Claes Leo, Johan, and Carl. Tyresö became a place for writing, but above all, a place of display of the collections that the Marquis had gathered. His collecting activities were intensified after the purchase of the estate, and at the turn of the century, they had reached a considerable number of artifacts. Considering the legitimist character of Lagergren's political views, his favor of the French Restoration, and his passion for biographies, it is clear that his collecting activities were oriented towards essentially 2 categories: Ancien Régime memorabilia and portraiture. As many late 19th century legitimists, he collected relics from the victims of the French Revolution, a category that at the time really crowded the art market. An interesting example of that in the Tyresö collection is the supposed piece of dress that supposedly had belonged to Marie Antoinette, set as you can see here in an opposite frame with doors like a little domestic altar. The piece was and is still displayed in a small corridor in Tyresö Castle. Engraved portraits were easily accessible and were inserted almost everywhere in the large house. Proper portraits, on the contrary, constituted a trickier quest. By the turn of the century, the European art market offered a lot for buyers with a penchant for 17th and 18th century art. But even in this context, Lagergren made proof of an eccentric choice. He was not interested in acquiring original paintings at auctions or through agents. He wanted proper copies of his favorite portraits, and especially those he knew so well from Versailles and some from the Louvre, I have to admit, and he was prepared to pay a lot for them. In 1905, the Marquis and John Howe went once again to Paris. After a visit to Musée Carnavalet, with its terrifying testimonials of the revolution, they literally fled to Versailles, where Lagergren was overwhelmed once again with joy to see the palace. This time, however, he was on a mission as a collector. One of the museum guards in the palace had suggested that he should contact a man who acted as a painting copyist within the palace organization, a Monsieur Jouve. Fortunately, Jouve was present at the time, and Lagergren could forward his request. He desired a full-scale copy of Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun's portrait of Marie Antoinette and her children. They agreed on the sum of 2,000 francs, and the contract was sealed. And here you can see on the right-hand side, of course, the portrait by Vigée-Lebrun, and on the left-hand side, you can see the rather faithful copy that Jouve made for Tyresö, and it's still displayed in the large drawing room in the castle. A few days later, the Marquis met with the director of the Musée de Versailles, Pierre de Nolac, who congratulated Lagergren on his choice and gave also his permission to copy the painting. This became the starting point for a long collaboration between the Marquis and Monsieur Jouve. Over the next years, the painter produced a high number of copies for Tyresö. The paintings clearly manifest exactly which royalties and courtiers that were closest to Lagergren's heart, and consequently their pictorial presence in the house was highly desirable, such as Latour's portrait of Louis XV and his queen, and Natier's portraits of Mesdames de France. and Latour's pastel of Jeanne-Antoinette de Pompadour. The portraits were installed in the drawing rooms of Tyresö, the scenographic setting that the Marquis had made for himself and for his family, and which reflected strongly to the visitors not only his views, but also the carefully constructed public persona that he had made with such care. After Caroline's death, Lagergren remarried another American lady of great fortune, Mary Moore Ogden. She followed her husband's interest, a fact that is testified by her touching personal copies of portraits of members of the Bourbon dynasty. For instance, as you can see here, a copy of Natier's painting of Marie Adélaïde de France, one of the daughters of Louis XV. Eventually, at her death in 1933, Mary was buried together with her husband in the Teutonic Cemetery in the Vatican. In 1930, the Marquis Claes Lagergren died. His estate of Tyresö, the collections, the archive, and the extensive grants were bequeathed to the Ethnological Museum, Nordiska Museet, in order to be kept as a house museum, showing the lifestyle and fashions of an upper-class home at the turn of the century. The bequest, much to the discontent of the Marquis' heirs, constitutes Lagergren's last and most desirable and durable monument, not only of his own era, but of a credo that went beyond religion and political views into the realm, I believe, of the concept of universal order. It is true that the site and the idea of Ancien Régime Versailles were not the only components in this credo, but most certainly it was that was closest to his heart and most anchored in his life as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.